The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild created a very unique situation. Essentially, it caused a collision of two distinct and different groups of fans. I'll refer to them in this video as Zelda veterans and Zelda newbies. In this video, I'm going to talk about the differences between these two groups of players, what they want from the sequel to Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and then my thoughts on these conflicting viewpoints. Real quick before we get started, I wanted to thank everyone for the support on my last Tears of the Kingdom video. It reached a lot of people and there were so many kind words in the comments. I'm incredibly grateful. If you find my videos entertaining and want to support a small YouTuber who's just getting started with big plans for the future, please consider subscribing. Enjoy the video! When Breath of the Wild came out, most series veterans who had been playing Zelda games for years, many of whom have played every 3D title to date, bought the game. The reactions were mixed within that community of players. Some disliked the game and felt it ruined the Zelda franchise. Many thought it was a good game, but not a good Zelda game. You've probably heard that phrase thrown around a lot before. Others went into the game feeling like the Zelda formula had been getting stale for years at that point, and they were hoping for a change. Therefore, they loved Breath of the Wild and easily adjusted to everything that changed from previous games. Obviously, there were other reactions, but I believe that covers the majority of them. Now, as I said before, the camp of players I just talked about were Zelda series veterans. The other main type of Breath of the Wild player is a separate and distinct group. This group is made up of new players to the series entirely. Breath of the Wild was their first Zelda game. Some of these people were younger, and therefore had just never played a Zelda game before due to their age. Many had never played a Zelda because the old games weren't interesting enough to them to grab their attention. Or maybe they'd played a game or two before and they didn't like it. I'd venture to guess that most of these players liked Breath of the Wild. Unlike Zelda veterans who felt pulled towards playing the game simply because it was an entry to the Zelda series, new players had nothing pulling them towards playing this game if it wasn't inherently interesting to them. That's not to say that all new players to the series liked Breath of the Wild, of course. There definitely are some who either didn't like it as a whole or didn't like certain aspects of it. So let's get into a little bit more of that now. As I mentioned before, most players from these two groups, the series veterans and the Zelda newbies, loved or at least liked Breath of the Wild. However, there were a fair amount of people in both groups who either disliked the game as a whole or some parts of it, albeit more heavily skewed within the Zelda veteran group. I think it's interesting to look at what specifically the players within each group liked and disliked about the game, and what they think would need to be fixed in order to make the sequel even better. Surprisingly, they're basically the opposites of each other. Starting off, many Zelda series veterans who disliked Breath of the Wild had a very specific idea of what Zelda games were to them, and they didn't want that to change fundamentally. Full disclosure, I fell into this group when the game first came out. Older Zelda games were unique in that very few, if any, other games really captured what made Zelda special. I love the Zelda series because of the things that make it different. The uniquely themed dungeons with fun puzzles, interesting mini-bosses and bosses in every dungeon, a little bit of structure so that the story can play out and there can be some meaningful progression, as well as new items that were obtained throughout the game. There are a lot of RPGs out there with similar game structures to the Zelda series, but without those key elements that made me fall in love with this series. A lot of Zelda veterans agree with me on that. And that's why a lot of them believe Breath of the Wild is a good game, but not a good Zelda game. The thought process being that Breath of the Wild is a good game, and a fun game, but it's so different from the older Zelda games we were used to that it's almost unrecognizable as a Zelda game at all. This camp of people believe that Tears of the Kingdom could improve on Breath of the Wild by adding back some or all of the elements that we recognize as being Zelda game staples. Ultimately, that's what we want to see in the sequel. Now onto the first-time Zelda players. For them, Breath of the Wild was the experience they were waiting for, a true open-world experience with the freedom to go anywhere and climb anything. It took the Legend of Zelda characters and general story and added modern-day popular gaming mechanics. Breath of the Wild offered an open world with a more challenging and sophisticated combat system. There were some puzzles and structured areas, but not very many. When you boil it down, Breath of the Wild is fundamentally very similar to other popular open-world games, like Elden Ring, for instance. The players within this camp don't have any nostalgia related to the old Zelda formula, unlike the fans in the other camp. Therefore, they don't care about a return to other Zelda tropes as much as Zelda veterans do, and in fact, they feel like Tears of the Kingdom could improve on Breath of the Wild by having even more freedom, an even bigger open world, even less structure within the world and the story. Essentially, they want Breath of the Wild 2.0, bigger and better. I just wanted to say here that I know I'm making a lot of generalizations. I completely understand that not everyone falls into these two camps, and that not everyone in these two camps agree with the points that I'm making. These are just a few very high-level general feelings and insights that I've heard from both sides of the fandom over the past 6 years since Breath of the Wild came out, especially since we heard that a direct sequel was in the works. With Breath of the Wild having a fan base where almost everyone can fall on one of two sides, inevitably there's going to be some disagreement about where Zelda should go in the future. At this point, from what I've seen of Tears of the Kingdom, it seems to me that the developers are siding more with the new Breath of the Wild players than the series veterans. As much as I don't like that personally, I can't really blame them. Breath of the Wild sold so many more copies than any other Zelda game ever, and was more critically acclaimed than any other Zelda game, except maybe Ocarina of Time. Critics and players alike loved this game overall. If you look at the sales numbers, people overall liked it more than any of the older Zelda games. So why wouldn't they cater the next game towards the people who liked Breath of the Wild, rather than the people who liked the older, less popular, and less sold games? Doing so would surely affect their bottom line, something a big corporation like Nintendo would not stand for. Ultimately though, like I've mentioned in other videos, we truly don't know what Tears of the Kingdom will bring yet, so there's still room for the developers to satisfy both sides of the fandom, and I truly hope they do. As a Zelda series veteran, I have come around to Breath of the Wild over the past couple years. When I first played it, I was immensely disappointed with the game, and I didn't like how far it strayed from the Zelda games I was used to. It just wasn't what I was expecting, and I'd be straight up lying if I said I wasn't genuinely sad about that. In fact, after initially playing through the game when it came out in 2017, I put it down for years without touching it because I just had no real interest. Instead, I replayed older Zelda games to fill that Link-shaped void in my life. I'm not someone who typically likes modern games that focus heavily on a large open world and complicated combat and crafting systems. I enjoyed the relative simplicity of combat in old Zelda games and mainly played them for puzzles and side quests that let me just relax and explore beautiful worlds. Although I would like the sequel to Breath of the Wild to more closely resemble what made me fall in love with the series in the first place, with more of a story focus, dungeons and puzzles over more complicated combat systems, better theming and better bosses, I don't think Tears of the Kingdom is a lost cause. I think some people are being way too presumptuous with their opinions at this point. I've heard many people say that they don't think the things that I want from this game will be there just because we haven't seen them yet, and therefore the game's gonna suck. This is a huge stretch. I trust Nintendo, and I think they'll make a great game. Sometimes, as the player, I think you have to admit that you might not always know what you want. I think I want the things that I just mentioned, dungeons, bosses, etc. But what if Nintendo makes a game that I absolutely love and that doesn't include all of these things that I think that I want? I'm staying positive. I know that the days of the old Zelda formula are likely gone. I think it's pretty clear, based on the financial success and positive feedback Breath of the Wild had, that this is the direction the series will be going in for the foreseeable future. I refuse to believe that the producers and game designers who made some of my favorite games of all time will suddenly be unable to impress me or entertain me anymore. I trust the studio knows what they're doing. I'm nervous that I haven't seen much of what I've said I want from this game from the trailers and gameplay footage we've gotten of Tears of the Kingdom, but that doesn't mean those things won't be there. Nintendo has shown off some sneak peeks, with new enemies and areas, new abilities, but that's because none of that would really spoil anything for anyone. I don't think that Nintendo would spend 6 years developing a game that's reusing the map of the previous one, as well as many assets, designs, the engine, etc., and then make it feel like the same game we've already played. In conclusion, there's nothing wrong with being a Zelda boomer and hoping for the return of more traditional Zelda elements in the next game. And equally, there's nothing wrong with being a new Zelda player who wants an even more open world with even more emphasis on combat and crafting and less on puzzles and story. I think the issue is when both camps prejudge a game that we've barely seen any part of and that none of us have played, or when people aren't respectful of the opinions of people in the opposite camp. I implore everyone who intends on playing this game, no matter your background, to stay open-minded. Go into the game with no prejudgments and just play and enjoy it. After you've played the game through, then you'll have an educated opinion about what you thought of it. Until then, I think we should all just try to respect what we think would be the perfect Zelda game may not align with someone else's thoughts, except that none of us actually know what it means to make a first-party Nintendo game. And trust that the developers who have always produced well put together and great games will provide us with a game that could be the best one ever. Thanks for listening to my little video essay there. I've seen so much discourse in the Zelda community, with lots of people being very negative about the direction of the series, and then other people being overly positive and even belittling people for having a differing opinion. Not everyone has to like open world games just because they're modern and popular right now. Just like not everyone has to care about the older Zelda games if it didn't mean that much to them in the first place. I look forward to playing Tears of the Kingdom when it comes out, and I think that no matter what, there will be a lot of surprises for me and a lot to love. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. I'm working on a Breath of the Wild playthrough right now on my channel with some Tears of the Kingdom content sprinkled in, and I'll be doing a Tears of the Kingdom playthrough once it comes out. That's all for this video. Have a good one.